Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rebuild SoCal Zone. Once again, I am your host, John Hakel, and the Executive Director of Rebuild SoCal Partnership. On today's episode, we will be speaking with a very special guest and discussing the topic of economic recovery during COVID-19. We hope you enjoy our lively discussion. Our guest today founded Beacon Economics in 2006. Under his leadership, Beacon has become one of the most well-known research organizations nationwide. He is also a contributor on economic issues for the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. We are thrilled to have as our very first guest, Dr. Christopher Thornberg.
Well, my pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. I'm honored to be your first guest. Again, thrilled to be here, and let's kick in. We got to talk about a lot of stuff.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. How has really COVID-19 affected the actual economy?
Well, obviously, when you go back to the start of this year, it's interesting. I like to say that Beacon Economics, we were on a bit of a victory tour. At the start of 2019, the stock market was down 20%. 80% of economists who contribute to the Wall Street Journal Next Recession Survey said there was going to be a recession by the end of 2020. Now, mind you, at the beginning of 2019, COVID didn't even exist, much less be in the forefront of people's thoughts about where the economy heading. They were panicked about real estate meltdowns. They were panicked about inflation. They were panicked about interest rates and the trade wars with China and so on and so forth. At the start of this year, all those fears turned out to be for naught. The economy kept cruising right along, right through 2019 and into the beginning of this year. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, COVID-19 shows up on our shores. And we went from an economy that was doing fine to an economy that saw a collapse in economic activity at a pace we've never seen before. Truly startling. The numbers we've seen in terms of the unemployment rate, economic activity are like we've never seen before. And of course, along with all these negative numbers is this dismal look ahead. As you probably know from just picking up the newspaper, most of the forecasters out there are talking to you. They're saying not only is this bad right now, but it's going to take a long time for us to recover.
Can you elaborate that more? Because I've heard, just like you, I've heard the U recovery and the V recovery. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's U's, there's V's, there are all sorts of other clever permutations of that. There's W's and L's and square root signs and Nike swooshes and everything else. It is funny that something as complex as macroeconomic forecasting devolves down to this letter game, if you will. But from my perspective, I think there's really two camps out there, the U camp and the V camp. Now, the U camp, to kind of put it succinctly, are those who say it's going to be a long, painful recovery, not unlike what happened during the Great Recession. The V camp says something a little different, which is no, it's going to be a relatively quick recovery. We're going to get back to normal levels of economic activity pretty rapidly, as long as, of course, we get full control over this virus, or at least partial control over this virus, in the relatively short term. Now, we have been in the V camp, which puts us really at odds with most of the forecasting world, including, of course, the Federal Reserve, who's been talking about long, painful recoveries, the Congressional Budget Office, who has some pretty dismal forecasts, and even, I think, a lot of the rank and file private sector forecasters out there. Why? Well, right off the bat, what we try to get people to know, and I think this is particularly important for people in the construction industry directly, is that the Great Recession was a really bad recession, not just from the fact that, it was a 6-quarter recession with about 6% decline in real GDP. The real painful part of the Great Recession was the recovery, because the recovery took almost 7 years. So the U.S. economy was operating at below full capacity for almost a decade. And when you think about the lost output, the lost income, it was a long, painful, ugly situation. And again, the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, that viewpoint, that idea, that thought process here, that this is going to be just like that, my question for those on the U camp is very simple. Why do you think that? What would make you feel this is going to be a long, painful recovery, outside of the fact that the last one had that fact feature? You have to be a little more sophisticated than that. It's not just what the last war was, right? It's what is actually happening this time. And the thing is this, particularly, and this is particularly true when it comes for construction and the overall construction sector. The Great Recession was so painful in part because of what happened prior to the Great Recession. It's a little bit history now, but between 2002 and 2007, this nation was witness to the greatest financial fraud of all time, the subprime asset securitization fraud that was really perpetuated on the US economy by Wall Street. Wall Street somehow or other managed to convince regulators and investors that they could take a bunch of bad debt and clump it together in an asset-backed security and more or less eliminate the risk and sell it off as gold-plated securities. Well, when we look back on it now, the entire idea seems preposterous, but back then they managed to sell this idea. And as a result of that, in short order, between really 2001 and 2007, you saw one of the greatest increases in debt we've ever seen in this nation. $15 trillion of new debt in 6 short years. We've never seen anything like that. And to be clear, a lot of that debt was bad debt. It was subprime mortgage debt, subprime credit card debt. Well, all this bad debt inflated the economy, inflated economic growth in the short term, but it also created structural problems within the US economy. Take, for example, the residential real estate market. All that money caused excessive demand for residential real estate. And not only did you see that in terms of the borrowing and the pace of price appreciation as crazed, gold in the eye investors ran around buying everything and anything they could as fast as possible, thinking it was their key to riches. But you saw, of course, the reaction of the real estate construction market itself, where developers built way too many homes over that short period of time. Now, of course, that also got into the consumer sector because households saw debt being given away functionally for free. And people said, hey, I don't need to save. Save was last generation's issue. We don't do that now. We just borrow what we need, right? And you saw savings rates go to this record low level as consumer spending went through the roof and the US economy opened a massive trade deficit. In 2006, while the economy might have felt good on the surface, it was rotten to the core based on, growth based on faulty fundamentals. Well, when the subprime credit engine turned off, that bubble collapsed. And what it left was an economy that was dangerously out of whack. You had households with too much debt, and all that wealth they thought they had just disappeared in a few months. You had an economy left with too many homes, empty homes, an economy left with too many cars. We had these huge stock flows. Households had to spend years rebuilding their balance sheets, saving an excessive amount to make up for the years of excess. Well, in the midst of the restructuring of the economy, you had a painful long run recovery. That's why the Great Recession was so bad. It was the structural problems that existed before the recession actually hit. Now, let's fast forward to the COVID-19 recession. Dramatic numbers, obviously a terrible tragedy. 200,000 Americans dead, a million people worldwide passed away from this disease, a negative 32% growth rate in the second quarter. We get it. It's a tragic circumstance. The numbers are truly dramatic. There's no arguing that. But this tragedy occurred in the midst of an economy that was fundamentally healthy. There was no massive housing bubble. There was no massive increase in consumer debt. In fact, if anything, if you looked at the economy in January of this year, it looked about as fundamentally as healthy as it's been in 30 years. Household savings rates were back up to 30-year highs, over 8%. You had a situation in which debt to income ratios were near record low levels in the US economy. Housing markets were suffering from excessive tightness, with the share of housing units for sale for rent at a record low rather than being at a record high like it was before the Great Recession. So as tragic as the circumstances are, it's still not a long run cycle. In many ways, the way to think about this is almost a national, if you will, natural disaster, rather than a true sort of buildup and then collapse of a financial bubble, which has a long-term effect. Natural disasters have sharp, disastrous, and tragic short-run results, but very little long-run ramifications for an economy. And that's true if you're talking about a hurricane, a massive earthquake, or a pandemic. Yes, it's tough in the short run, but once we get control of things, things get back to normal relatively quickly. Now, that's been our viewpoint right from the get go. And while we appreciate that that's been really out of sync with a lot of other folks' opinions on things, I would go the next step and say, guess what? The V has already happened. You remember, when you talk about recessions, the metric, the NBER, that's the National Bureau of Economic Research, those are the guys who date these things. The metric they use for recessions is what's called peak to trough, the peak of economic activity to the bottom of economic activity. The peak of economic activity during the Great Recession was in the fourth quarter of 2007, December of 2007. The bottom of economic activity was June of 2009. So it was an 18th month recession and then a 7.5 year recovery afterwards. This time around, believe it or not, the recession ended in April. Yes, a phenomenal decline in economic activity, and that decline ended in April of this year. And May, June, and July have seen substantial bounce back in economic activity. The V is already in place. It's not even debatable right now. Now, we're not all the way back. Obviously, we have a ways to go, and the virus is still not under control. But for anybody who's thinking about the third quarter, you're already lined up for a 32 to 36% growth rate. It's not going to erase all the damage in the second quarter, but it is going to erase most of it. The natural disaster aspect of this is fading away, and now we just have what's the mild leftover effects of what happened to the economy while we were closed fighting off the pandemic. So it's nothing like the Great Recession. It has nothing like the long recovery. And candidly, for people in the construction industry, you shouldn't be thinking of this as a Great Recession type episode. Rather, this is something that you will get back to work relatively quickly. It's just a function of everybody working together to get control over this virus.
Chris, thank you. That is what we're looking for, kind of a compendium of where we're at, what did this virus do, how fast will the economy come back,
Yeah.
what tools can we use to assist in the kickstart of our actual economy. So how much would you, I don't want to use the word blame, but how much of this negativity is truly based on media process?
Well, yeah, that's the whole fake news conversation, right? And we heard that. And I don't want to dive into the fake news conversation. But I will tell you that over the last decade, I have watched the US economy really move into an odd place from a sociological standpoint. Um, we think back to the Reagan years, and while we all knew there were some tough challenges out there, for the most part, politics, the newspapers tended to focus on hope, change, forward progress, the city of lights on the hill, morning in America, the positive, the upsides, right? But ever since the Great Recession, and maybe even a little bit before it, we as a country have moved mentally into a different place. It's interesting. In the beginning of 2019, to put this in context, 80% of the economists who contributed to the Wall Street Journal Next Recession Survey said we were going to have a recession. Now, they weren't talking about COVID, by the way, in January of that year. They were talking about the Chinese trade war and rising interest rates and heating up inflation and all these terrible things that were going to sink the expansion. And if they weren't predicting the next recession, they were telling us just how terrible the expansion has been. Now, if you actually take a step back and ask how good was the last expansion, the answer was it was really good. I realize from a growth perspective, maybe not as exciting as it's been in the past, but steady growth is good growth. It means you're not getting overheated. You're not likely heading for some big meltdown. And equivalently, a lot of the gains in society are gains that we don't actually measure. I mean, you think about the phenomenal access we have to information and entertainment now, just by having a smartphone in our pocket. We all take it for granted without ever appreciating it. 10, 15 years ago, you didn't have a smartphone in your pocket that could give you an infinite number of hours of entertainment. None of these things get factored in. Now, you take the whole sum of this conversation and we call it miserabilism. This constant need to take whatever's going on and make it worse than it actually is. Part of this is politics, the politics of extremism. After all, if you are catering to extreme political parts of your party, the best way of getting your not extreme parts of your party to ignore that is by simply vilifying the other side of the aisle. Politics is no longer about the Democrats or Republicans offering different ideas and see which ones people like more or less. Now it's about vilifying the other side and demonizing the other side. And those people did this and those people did that. And that's scary stuff. But when you take a step back from that kind of crazy rhetoric, things are pretty good.
Given that, Chris, what should the federal government do? Should they again have another stimulus package?
My answer would be no. Now, again, I get it. That sounds completely different than everything you're hearing in the news, everything you're hearing on the national media. We desperately need another stimulus plan. But remember, the whole point of stimulus is to increase spending to help the economy recover. The problem with the virus is that people can't spend money. You can't get on an airplane. You can't go to Disneyland. You can't go to your favorite restaurant. Giving people money that they can't actually spend is a little bit pointless. So I would argue that yes, you probably want to work at making sure that unemployed people continue to have expanded unemployment benefits. That to me makes a lot of sense. But beyond that, most of the stimulus that we did in the second quarter of this year, this massive $3 trillion plan, that even hasn't actually had a chance to be really help the economy yet. Look, for all the money they pumped into the economy through the unemployment, the PPP program, through these direct checks to American households, because people can't spend, the vast majority of that has done nothing more than go into the banking system in the form of savings. Over the last 6 months, American households have actually built up almost $1.5 trillion in new savings. $1.5 trillion. That's a crazy high number for just a few short months. Commercial bank deposits have gone from 13.2 to $15.6 trillion in 6 months. That cash is sitting there waiting to be spent. And when it is able to be spent, it's going to cause this economy to rock and roll. The most important thing is to not talk about stimulus, but to get the virus under control, to continue to push national mandates about things that we think are actually going to help. For example, let's make sure people wear their masks. It's not a debatable conversation. We know it helps. Everybody should be wearing a mask. It should not even be a part of the political debate. Sadly, it gets to really, I think, really part of the problem where we are today as a country. We're so polarized, we're so politicized that we can't even have a basic common sense conversation about wearing a mask without it devolving into the right and the left screaming at each other about who did what, when, why. But in the end, focus on getting control of the virus because, again, the faster we do that, the faster that money can come out of those checking accounts and the faster this economy gets back to normality. It's the virus, not the economy.
Chris, having said that, and as you know, our Rebuild Zone listeners are mostly based in Southern California. Can you tell me the difference between what will be affected by here in Southern California versus the nation?
Yeah. No, another good question. Um, Southern California, I mean, listen, when you think about this COVID situation, it's worldwide. It's dramatic everywhere. The shocks rippling through the supply chains are hitting everywhere from Temecula to Timbuktu, if you will. Everybody's feeling this craziness. But when you come into Southern California, obviously it changes the situation just a little bit. For example, remember Southern California is a little bit more oriented towards tourism. I mean, think of Disneyland, for example, in the middle of Anaheim. Nothing's going on. Disneyland's closed. The hotels, the convention center around Disneyland are closed. And obviously that means that a place like Orange County is getting hit harder than, say, San Bernardino County. And that's because, again, tourism plays that much of a larger role in Orange County than it does out in the Inland Empire. So, in a sense, we are feeling a little bit more than other parts of the U.S. Now, there's another part of it too, which is I also think that, again, getting into the politicalization, the polarization of these conversations, California has maybe been a little bit more draconian when it comes to dealing with the virus than other places. Here, they feel like the government has to take a stronger stand on things. Arizona never closed their restaurants. And as a result of that, they didn't take as big of a hit as California has. Now, mind you, Arizona had a big surge in cases like we did, and they had a big drop off in cases, just like we're seeing right now as well, without ever closing their restaurants. So, in some ways, we're getting hit a little bit harder because of the nature of our local economy. In some ways, we're getting hit a little bit harder because of course, government mandates. So, it's a little bit different. We're a little bit behind, but I would argue that just like the rest of the country, as long as we work hard and work together to get control over this virus, will allow the economy to get back to normal, and it's going to happen relatively quickly. Again, it's not about the economy, it's about the virus.
How will this affect the construction industry in Southern California?
Yeah. And that's it. And I get it. This is the audience, right? You're wondering what's going to happen next. Should I be training more people? Should I not be training? If you're in the unions, should I be cutting off new apprentices coming in and everything else? Here's my answer. I'm going to sum this up in one word. Just, well, it's not one word. I'm going to sum it up in one statement. Just keep working. Just keep planning. Just keep moving ahead. Look, remember, when we hit the Great Recession, we had a vast excess supply of new homes across this country. And of course, because of the collapse in wealth, you saw the number of potential home buyers absolutely collapse. And the residential building industry went through a prolonged, painful slump. And that was reflected in, and not quite as bad, but pretty close in the commercial space as well. Well, look, none of that is happening right now. I mean, the real pessimists out there were telling us that, for example, home prices were going to fall, that there was going to be a whole bunch of new commercial delinquencies. None of those things has happened because, again, we entered this cycle with a very, very healthy housing market, a housing market that was actually suffering more from a dearth of supply than oversupply. And it's not a big stretch. I don't, if I told your folks this 4 or 5 months ago, they might be skeptical. They might be thinking, that Thornberg guy, it's a nice message, but I'm not sure I can trust that. It's too optimistic given what everybody else is saying. But take a step back and ask where the construction industry is right now. Take, for example, home sales. Home sales collapsed from March to May. And then starting in May, going up to August, there was an explosion of new home sales, one of the biggest increases we've ever seen. Interest rates are down. People are sitting on tons of money. And by the way, they're stuck at home and they're realizing just how small their home is. There is demand for housing. There's demand to fix your current home up. Retail, think about Home Depot and Lowe's. They're packed to the brim. It's one of the hottest parts of retail right now. People are spending money on their house because the economy is still healthy. And if you can't go out to dinner, if you can't go to Paris or Disneyland, well, I'm going to spend it on my house. So the construction industry is actually doing pretty well right now, and they will continue to. It's a good sign, and it will continue. There's no doubt about it, and that's true in the commercial space as well. So no, you're not going to see a prolonged downturn. You've already seen the bounce back in activity. In other words, it's a good time to actually be in the space and to continue to go out and look for new clients because they're out there. There's people with money they want to spend, and you knock on the door and go, hey, well, how about spending on a new kitchen? Maybe they don't just do that, getting that new development off the ground. Now, again, there's still some turmoil in the financial world, and the banks, of course, are still scared. So it isn't there is still some constraints, but the forces for positive demand are really truly overwhelming at the moment, and they will continue to push back against those negatives. And when we get control of the virus, you're going to see a nice big push in the construction space. So it's going to be a good couple of years in that sense. Now, here's my warning, because I'm an economist. I can't be all sunshine and rainbows, right? At some point in time, I gotta tell you where the rubber really hits the road. And this is what worries me. It's not so much what's happening now. As tragic as the current circumstances are, the economy is already and will continue to bounce back strongly, and construction will continue to stay strong. But let's go back to the political situation and the excessive overreaction that we're seeing to the presence of the virus. The federal government is going to borrow probably close to $4 trillion this year. As a percent of GDP, that's more than ever before. That's borrowing more right now than we did during World War II. As a relative to what happened during the Great Recession under Obama, back then we were running deficits of a trillion and a half. This is over 3 times that. You're talking about the federal government borrowing more money over the next year, that $4 trillion, okay, than the entire increase in debt markets in 2019. If you put every public and private borrower together, they all borrowed about $3 trillion in 2019. And this year alone, the federal government's got to borrow $4 trillion. Well, right now, that's okay because people are saving money and the banks have nothing better to do with their money than buy treasuries. But when people start spending again and the government is borrowing like a drunken sailor on a short shore leave, interest rates are going to start going up. And the same thing with the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve is acting as if this is a great recession scenario with a collapse in wealth causing deflationary pressures. But there has been no collapse in wealth. Wealth is up, not down. And all their excessive activity, quantitative easing, is now causing this time the money supply to grow like never before. You say, wait a minute, money supply growing, that's inflationary. Bingo. So you do see a circumstance by which the excessive government reaction to what's going on right now could lead to higher interest rates and higher inflation in 2 to 3 years. And I'll tell you, as good as construction is going to be over the next couple of years, if inflation and interest rates start rising sharply in 3 years, that's what's going to set off the next big real estate cycle. So while it's good right now, it's going to get ugly unless policymakers make an abrupt change over the next 4 to 8 months. And right now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So, in the Great Recession, the answer would have been lay off half your staff, go into bunker mentality, and survive the next 4 years. This time, I'm telling you, man up, work like heck over the next 4 years, but be prepared for that interest rate inflation cycle in 4 years from now. That's when you're going to start feeling the pain.
Wow. Chris, thanks. Home building is such a large part of our entire lives, but in the rebuild zone, we have contractors that are kind of in the heavy civil, the road, bridges, water projects. What are you foreseeing there?
Right. Well, I mean that's another good question. Now, again, in the short run, obviously, these sectors are not influenced. They are typically working on projects that were funded a year or 2 years ago, and they continue to move forward at doing what they're doing because, as you know, the many governors across the United States have said that construction should continue. It's an essential industry, and so they're going to be fine on that. But then, what happens in a couple of years? What do you see? How should this shake out? Well, I think you do have to be worried for two major reasons. The first, of course, is uh, in the midst, if you will, of all this chaotic overreaction to the virus, you are absolutely going to see a problem with funding of major infrastructure investments in a couple of years. I mean, the federal government's borrowing $4 trillion, which is a phenomenal amount of money, and we just don't know how that's going to impact credit markets and what that will do, if you will, to states and counties or local governments who may want to borrow some money to build a new highway. I mean, if interest rates are going up, it's going to be tougher to get that new lane put down. And that's a problem. We all know about that, right? So that's absolutely the case. And of course, equivalently, these those local budgets are just getting hammered right now. You think about, for example, here in Southern California, so many local governments rely on sales taxes and transit occupancy taxes. They're not getting that money. That's putting them into a financial bind. And yet again, they're going to have less money to put in infrastructure. So that is an issue. But there's one more issue, too, I think to bring up. And I think it's good for your Southern California members to be thinking about. When you think about California, when you think about our economy, a lot of folks like to diss our economy. Oh, high taxes, bad regulations, everybody's fleeing the state. Look, yes, we have a terrible business climate. I'm the first person to agree with that because I run a business here. But I can also tell you this: business climate is actually not a primary determinant on economic success. Indeed, over the last decade, California has been an economic success story that's seen income growth and job growth and economic output growth at a greater than national level. Now, in the last couple of years, that has slowed down tremendously, and it's slowed down because of a complete lack of housing. Now, housing is a big, complex issue in California. I can sum it up this way: we don't build enough of it. Now, the state has been desperately trying to figure out how to get more housing built, and they haven't been doing a very good job of it, even when they were focused on it. But when you think about what's going on right now, they've lost their focus. They're not talking about how we need to get more housing. What they're talking about is how do we prevent evictions for the next 2 years despite the fact that we don't think evictions are actually that big of a problem. They've turned it into one, but there's not one shred of real data that would suggest the idea that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Californians are that far behind on the rent that they're going to lose their apartment to eviction. There's just no evidence to back that up. But they're turned it into a crisis, a political crisis, and they're going to respond to it. And ultimately, they could be doing our housing markets more harm than good. Look, everybody who lives here and runs a business here, whether you're an economist or you run a construction company or you have a supermarket or you're running a private school, we all want more growth. And more growth is going to be driven by more housing. It's the single most important issue, and that was true a year ago. It's going to be true a year from now. And guess what? It's still true right now, even though we're still so focused on this COVID issue that we've forgotten about it completely. So I think all your folks who have a voice, who are there talking to our political elected leaders, who are talking to the folks who run cities on a day to day basis, and you need to let them know that they can't forget the long run, that they have to continue to work on these critical issues on how to expand our housing supply so that California can continue to grow in the midst of this COVID problem as well as afterwards. We all have to remind them not to forget the long run. And again, in these crazy times, that's exactly what's happening.
Wow, that that is the most cogent way of talking to our general contractors. Thank you, Chris, so much.
Well, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. And if your folks are looking for a little more data, some pictures to back this up, see some of the things we're talking about, I would suggest they go to beaconeconomics.com or beaconecon.com. That's my company's website, and you'll find all sorts of materials there. You can sign up for our newsletter and get this information on a timely basis if that's what helps you move ahead. Ultimately, we are here to help people better understand the world around them in a period of time where basically when you turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper, it's highly likely that you are not being fed what I would call good data. You're being fed dramatic headlines that push, if you will, advertising sales, not, if you will, helping your members better know what's going on. So that's what we're here for. And again, be ready because the next few years are going to be good once we get this chaos out of the way.
Doctor, thank you so much. This
My
has been
pleasure.
a great informational process, and I'm so pleased to have you as our first guest.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.